Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Patrick Tapia. I'm the Vice President of Counseling for HS2 Academy. Welcome to today's seminar. Our topic for today is enhancing your academic profile for college admissions. So, what we're really going to be talking about here are different strategies that you could use no matter where you are in the academic spectrum, even if you're like a straight A student, or maybe you're struggling a little bit because of the online learning environment that COVID has necessitated. I want to talk about like tips and strategies, things that you can do to try to be as competitive as possible for when you're finally applying to college. For today, I think this is probably going to be a little bit more useful, I would say, for students who are younger than, let's say, for example, people who are going to be rising seniors already, because there's more time for you to implement some of these strategies. Now, of course, if you're a rising senior, some of the advice here could still be applicable and still be helpful, but you may not have as much time to implement it, unfortunately. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Before we go any further, I do ask that you refrain from recording any of the information in today's seminar. Much of the information you will see is proprietary to our company, and we ask that you respect that. Okay, so first and foremost, why are grades now so much more important than they were before? Well, in simple terms, it's largely because of the decline of standardized testing as a factor in college admissions. Many colleges, out of necessity, had to remove standardized testing as a required component of college application requirements, right? So what's ended up happening is that other factors have become more important. Okay, now, of course, historically, grades are probably the most important factor anyway. So, minus something like the SAT or ACT, it becomes even more of a challenge for admissions people to look very closely at the academic record and try to see which students they feel are going to be the most qualified to go to their schools. Okay, so based on the experience we saw last application season, right? So this is the previous fall. For a lot of top universities, we ended up seeing about 30% of applicants to top schools applying as test optional, right? Which meant they chose not to submit either the SAT or the ACT. And it's also no surprise, though, that a lot of students who chose to go test optional were also straight A students, right? So I think there's a high percentage. I don't know the exact percentage, but it's definitely more than half of the students who went test optional to a lot of these top colleges were straight A students. Okay, so at this point, then, these are going to be like realities that we're dealing with, right? So at least for the foreseeable future, I think for this next upcoming cycle, most schools are still going to be test optional. But if you're a younger student, let's say, for example, you're only going to be a rising freshman or rising sophomore, things could very well change by the time you're applying. So it's definitely good to pay attention, keep up with the news and updates, and continuing attending our seminars so that we can help inform you of the latest trends in admissions. Okay, so historically, like I mentioned, grades have always been the most important factor. So this source comes from NACAC, which is the National Association for College Admissions Counselors. It's like the governing body of all admissions counselors, high school guidance counselors, and private college counselors, right? And they publish a survey. They used to publish a survey every single year, but in recent years they haven't done it. But as you can see here, this probably hadn't changed too much from the previous year or two. And as you can see, the three most important factors that are rated by admissions people have directly to do with your courses and your grades, although they're looking at slightly different aspects of your courses and the grades, right? So obviously the grades are the most important factor, but they're also assessing how strong your classes are. If you're looking at other sources, this is also sometimes called academic rigor. How difficult is the schedule of your classes in terms of, are you taking more challenging honors or AP classes, or are you simply taking only regular classes, right? So obviously, like if you're taking more difficult college level classes, that's going to be viewed in a much stronger light than if you're simply taking regular classes. So the big change, of course, here is that immediately below that, you'll notice that admission test scores, SAT or ACT, were the next most important component. So minus that, then it becomes like just a mix of all the other factors. Based on what I've been reading and hearing from admissions people, they just put a little bit more focus on the grades at that point, right? So they take a closer look in terms of what courses the students are taking, what they're doing above and beyond the classroom experience. If they're doing anything outside of that, that also factors in as well. Okay, so how do colleges go about evaluating the GPA? So it's not really as simple as, oh, I have a higher weighted GPA, therefore I will automatically get into better colleges, right? So GPA wasn't meant to be something that you can compare across the board, right? It's not a universal metric that all schools have in common, right? So it's not really a logical or fair comparison oftentimes to say like, oh, this student from Southern California, because their high school, say for example, has AP classes available as early as freshman year, has a 4.5, and that person would, like you would maybe assume might be able to get in better schools than, say, for instance, with a student with a 4.3. But if you looked at the context of a 4.3 student, let's just say, if that 4.3 student came from a different high school where they didn't offer as many weighted classes, and 4.3 was actually the max or the highest level you could get, then, obviously at that point, they're going to put more weight on the student who did get a 4.3 if that was the maximum that you could get, right? So they try to look at these things as contextually as possible. So they're not simply looking for just a higher number. Okay. So also it's important to note that colleges will oftentimes recalculate your GPA. So, they're not always just going to look at whatever the number it is that shows up on your transcript, right? So oftentimes many institutions like the UCs, for instance, a lot of other public universities, for instance, will have their own in-house, different formulas and calculators to help them figure out what they want to prioritize in their calculations. So for instance, like the UCs will primarily be looking at 10th grade and 11th grade. Yes, they'll be able to see the GPA from 9th grade still, right? It's because it's part of the application. But when they're calculating their in-house GPA for you, they will be primarily looking at 10th grade and 11th grade. Okay. All right, so there are a lot of other factors as to why it's very difficult to compare GPAs. I mean, for one, not every school system even uses the same GPA or grading system, right? So if you were looking at countries all over the world, for instance, right, not every single school even uses an A through F grading system. Some use percentiles, some use like a 1 to 7 scale or 1 to 9, or some don't even use like a quantitative measure, right? They use qualitative terms, for instance, to describe like a pass or a high pass or something like that. So it's going to be really, really difficult then for admissions people to do a straight up comparison simply based on GPA. There are also differences in the rigor of the high school that you attend. Okay, so many of you probably know this by reputation, right? Even within the same school district, there are going to be certain schools where like, oh, that's the hardest school in the district, and there's someone else who goes maybe to an easier school, so that even if that student were to get straight A's, they're maybe doing it with a lot less work than someone who's attending like the hardest school within the school district, right? So and you don't necessarily want to assume that it's not fair that colleges would always view these numbers equally. They don't, right? So if you attend a harder high school, they're willing to evaluate it based on that context. So a student who got 1 or 2 Bs at a much harder high school may potentially even be just as competitive or more competitive than a student who got straight A's at a smaller middle of nowhere high school that is not really known to be very competitive, right? So the rigor and the difficulty of your high school matters. So, thankfully, many of our students at HS2 do attend areas where you're going to have very competitive high schools, not just for California, but actually nationwide, right? So it's an asset, so if there are any students in the audience today, don't get mad at your parents because they sent you to a hard high school. In fact, it's a blessing. It's an advantage for you as long as you take advantage of that by getting the best possible grades you can. Okay, because if you're, even if you went to the best high school, if you're getting like C's and D's, that's not going to help you any. In fact, it's going to backfire and hurt you. Okay. It's also important to keep in mind that not every school even has a weighted grading system. There are certain private schools, for instance, that do not even offer any AP or honors classes. So they only report an unweighted GPA, right? So that complicates things a little bit more. So what colleges then do is they assemble a history of each high school, right? So that's why they oftentimes have admissions counselors or admissions representatives who are in charge of a certain district or territory. So they're supposed to know all the different high schools in the area so that when they see a student, they can sort of evaluate that student within the context of what they were competing in, what that was available to them, how difficult the teachers and the classes were in that particular school or area, okay? All right. So oftentimes, what we tell parents and students is that it's oftentimes hard to make this apples to apples comparison with students from other countries and other high schools across the nation. But you will oftentimes be directly compared versus students within your own high school, right? So let's say, for example, you have aspirations to go to top schools, but you're not even like in the top 10% of your school, it's going to be very difficult, right? So it's oftentimes something where you do want to take a look at what types of classes students who are at the top of your graduating class are taking, because they will oftentimes be your direct point-to-point comparison for the schools that you're looking for. So some high schools actually offer a class rank. If that's something your high school does, great. In a way, then you have a little bit more of a sense numerically where you stand compared to the rest of your peer group. But if they don't, oftentimes colleges just look at their historical data for your school. Okay. So they will notice from the past 3, 4, 5 years, they will see, what the average GPA is of the students who they accepted from their school, and they'll already have a baseline to be able to compare, right? Oftentimes, if your school uses websites like Naviance, you should be able to see how you compared versus other students who got accepted or rejected from those colleges, right? So oftentimes those websites are very helpful in order for you to figure something like that out. Okay, colleges will often try to contextualize your academic performance. What that means is they'll look at a combination of hard factors like your grades and test scores if they accept them or if you submit them, and other soft factors like recommendation letters, your essays, from your counselor, right? Your counselor will also write a recommendation letter because your counselor will oftentimes have a better view of how you stack up against the rest of your senior year class, let's just say, okay? All right, so one other way to envision this is that you can kind of see your GPA, the number, okay, as one line or one axis in a graph here, and the rigor of your coursework as another. So you can take a look at these in terms of, yes, you can have a really high GPA, but really low rigor in the sense that you're not taking challenging classes, or vice versa. You can have a low GPA or high rigor. So ideally, though, you kind of want both, right? So if you had, like, let's say student A, and student A had a 3.2 unweighted GPA, right? And only about a 3.3 weighted because maybe the student only took two honors classes, that would put that student here in the chart, right? So they'd be, yeah, so not too bad GPA, but not too great in terms of the rigor scale either. Okay, now if you had another student, let's call them student B, who had a perfect GPA, but then the student didn't really take any honors or AP classes, and that puts them around here in the scale, right? So pretty good GPA, but not necessarily quite as impressive because the student didn't show himself or herself to, take very challenging coursework. So it's going to be impressive, but not quite as impressive, right? So ideally, you want something like student C. So student C, for instance, has an unweighted GPA of 4.0, perfect GPA, and also took, let's say, in the course of what was available in their high school, let's say 12 AP courses, right? So it puts them at a weighted GPA of, let's say, 4.5. So that would put them here, right? And this is actually the range where you want to be. If your aspiration is to get into a top 10, top 15 university, this is kind of the range you want to be, right? So ideally for very selective colleges, they're looking for the best possible GPA that you can sustain and also taking the most rigorous classes that are available to you, okay? That's the reality of how competitive top colleges are these days, right? They're so selective because they have they have their pick of the lot of the most talented students across the country and in fact, across the world, right? So they do have the luxury of being able to pick students who are not just, great in terms of like the grades that they're getting, but are also challenging themselves by taking, advanced classes that show they're, capable of performing at a collegiate level already, even while they're still in high school. Okay. So what's important to keep in mind here is that when you're looking to try to see, so like what GPA do you actually need for certain schools then? Don't just look at the published averages for many universities because like there's certain schools, for instance, that'll say like, here's our average GPA. The reason why averages can be really misleading is that there are also a lot of students that they're accepting for one reason or another who maybe have lower GPAs that because the university has a vested interest in wanting to have a much more diverse, incoming class, they're going to take some students for one reason or another that's not necessarily because of their pure academic performance. Okay, so if you're trying to get into school largely by virtue of academics, you definitely want to be at the upper range, right? So if available, if a certain school publishes, here's the GPA range, here's like the 25th percentile GPA and the 75th percentile one, you want to be in the upper 25%, okay? Because, you know, there are going to be certain students, for instance, who will naturally drag down that average, right? So, I mean, at the risk of generalizing, you know, they might be accepting certain students that they want on board, you know, who are like maybe athletes or underrepresented minorities, maybe, or certain VIP cases who may or may not have necessarily the average GPA. Sometimes they could be much lower, but because the school really wants them there, they'll accept them there, and that kind of like drags down their average a little bit. Okay, so a more realistic rule of thumb, I would say, is that if your aspiration is like an Ivy League level school, okay, so like the Ivy, Stanford, MIT, even like schools like Duke these days, right? So ideally you want no Bs, but maybe you like one B at most. The moment you have two or three Bs, it becomes extremely difficult for you to even have a shot, okay? For the top UCs, if you're looking at like a Berkeley or UCLA or schools like Michigan, USC, like NYU, you probably want about two or three Bs at most, right? I mean, there's certain students who get in even with like four or five Bs, but you know, in many cases, they're more like the exception rather than the rule. These days, though, these schools that you see here, their acceptance rates are dropping very, very fast. I think last that I saw, UCLA was at about 11 or 12%. USC is about the same now. Berkeley's at about 14%, right? And NYU is already under 20%, right? So all these schools have become much, much more competitive over the last few years, okay? And now, of course, if your aspiration is like a mid-tier UC or any of the private colleges and universities that are ranked within like, let's say 40 to 80 in US News, I would say no more than about four or five Bs for you to still be reasonably competitive for the school. Okay, so that's just the realities that we're facing right now. Keep in mind, these are more like rules of thumb. It does not mean you cannot apply. It does not mean that you can prove me wrong and basically like a year from now tell me, oh, I got in and I had like seven Bs, right? But like if you're looking in general at the statistics we have in terms of the students who are getting into these schools, this is kind of closer to the number that you would want in order for you to be actually competitive for those schools. Okay. All right. So what you really want to try to do as much as possible is to have a balanced class schedule, right? So the two things that you're juggling here are having difficult classes that you can handle, but ones that you could still try to get straight A's from as much as possible. So that's sometimes not easy for you to figure out, but I would say use your prior performance as a baseline. So let's say, for instance, if you got A's in almost all your classes, but you struggled a little bit, let's say with honors chemistry, then maybe you might want to kind of like think very carefully as to whether or not you want to try for AP Bio or AP Chem the following year. Okay. You might want to just go with like APs for like four of your classes, but maybe take a regular science class, especially if you're not thinking of becoming a science major anyway. Right. So these are all things that you can adjust or calibrate. But oftentimes you're going to want to get the advice of your school counselor. And if you're getting private counseling from like a place like HS2 Academy, we can help advise you and take a look at the track record of other students from your high school and what we know about you personally as to whether or not you can handle an even more rigorous schedule. Now, don't sell yourself short either. Just because you got a bad grade or two, it doesn't mean that you're doomed to forever get B's and C's in that sort of subject, right? Very often we've had students before, maybe because they struggled for one reason or another, or because maybe the situation with COVID having online learning be less than ideal, they maybe struggled with a class or two. But it doesn't mean that you're doomed to repeat the same thing next year, right? So I think it's very important for you to go ahead and try as much as possible to really prepare for the upcoming school year, right? And I'll give you some tips and advice in terms of how to prepare for the upcoming school year, but it's really all about a balancing act, right? So you don't always necessarily want to go with 6 APs. That's not always the best idea for most. Like I would say the vast majority of students are not cut out to take 6 APs in a given year, okay? So you'd have to really weigh what's an appropriate course schedule for you, for your individual circumstance. Okay, so I will be going through 5 major kind of thematic areas where I think that you can implement some strategies to maintain or improve your GPA. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is summer previewing. Well, what is summer previewing? right? Does that mean taking summer school and repeating? Nope. It means looking ahead, right? So oftentimes when our students preview for the upcoming school year, that means that you're actually crafting a game plan for you to either self-study, right, for the upcoming school year, or take a class to prepare so that you will like look at the material that you're going to be covering for the next school year so that you have a head start over the rest of your peers. Okay. So this doesn't mean just, oh, I ordered the textbook and I flipped through a couple of chapters, right? So I think in order for it to be more effective, you want to actually treat it almost like a class, right? So have like maybe 2 or 3 times a week, have a set fixed time that you're going to sit there, read through the book on your own, and maybe start doing some of practice problems based on the actual course or material that you're covering. Right. So it's also important, though, not to be overly ambitious and say, I'm going to cover all of AP biology. I'm going to study the entire Campbell textbook in one summer. Because oftentimes you don't necessarily want to sacrifice mastery for depth, breadth, right? So it's impressive. It sounds impressive if you cover the entire school year, but oftentimes, if you end up forgetting a lot of the stuff by the time the school year actually starts, then it doesn't really help you as much, right? So our philosophy is to focus more on mastery. So oftentimes, if you were to take a course, a preview course with HS2, or if our counselors are helping students, have a game plan for how to prepare for the upcoming school year, we often tell them try to focus on the first semester material as much as possible, right? And try to see if you can really, hopefully, master and understand that material so that by the time the school year starts, you are well ahead. And it helps you in different ways because not only do you actually know the material better and consequently could do better in tests, you will ask more intelligent questions in class as well, and you'll be able to impress your teachers and hopefully get better recommendation letters. Okay. So oftentimes, we do advise students to seek out supplemental instruction because it's very easy sometimes to come up with an idealistic plan about like how you're going to study for the upcoming school year, but then one thing or another happens. You end up going on an unplanned trip with your family, or you just get really busy, or you just get really lazy or lose focus, right? So oftentimes if you had a class, if you had a tutor helping you out, there's more accountability, right? There is more of a sense of urgency to go ahead and map out exactly what you need to do to prepare for the upcoming school year. Okay. Now, keep in mind, you can also prioritize. You do not have to preview for every single one of your upcoming classes. I would say at most try to prioritize 2 or 3 classes that you think you're going to have the most difficulty with in the upcoming school year, and then come up with a game plan for how you're going to approach that. Okay. So to tell you the truth, this is actually the big secret for how there are certain students at your high school who could probably handle like 4, 5, or 6 APs, no sweat, and be able to get straight A's, is because they will oftentimes use the summer before to prepare, right? To get a head start so that they can handle an even more difficult schedule than the average student at your school. Okay, so here's a sample snippet of like one of our schedules for this summer, right? So one of the advantages of taking classes with HS2 Academy is that we have branches in almost all the competitive areas in California, right? So oftentimes there's going to be an HS2 branch probably pretty close to where you live, right? And every summer we'll have online, and hopefully in the future we'll have in-branch classes as well, so that you can take advantage of teachers who actually know your high schools pretty well and who can craft a study plan to help you prepare for the classes that you'll be taking at your local high school. All right, so the next little tidbit or strategy that I will be giving you here has to do with time management. Okay, yes, now I know you've heard before, yes, manage your time and schedule, but I want to give you a little bit more in-depth strategies in terms of what this actually means pragmatically and how this can improve your GPA. Okay, so first of all, it's very important for you to use a calendar or scheduling app to make sure that your day and week are being used to full advantage, right? Block out like review or study times, right? Try to see when your meetings or games are going to be so that you don't end up, let's say not having enough time to study for a quiz or a test, right? So seeing everything in front of you, like being able to see like the whole week unfold, can give you that proper sort of like foresight to be able to map out exactly when you're going to have time to study, when you're going to have time to do homework. Okay. Another really good tip is for you to review immediately after your classes. So oftentimes I tell students it's far more efficient. Let's say, for example, if you finished a long day of school, even if you're spending like 10, 15 minutes just really quickly glancing over your notes from that particular day, there are actually studies that prove that actually helps with long-term memory rather than cramming right before your test. okay? Because it sinks in a little bit more while it's still fresh in your brain. So it's like sort of like etching it in stone in your mind, right? Once you got a chance to look over what your teacher covered that day, okay? So another important tip is you got to really be disciplined, right? Try to do all your homework before you go ahead and prioritize your me time, right? So I know it's important to have some balance because you don't want to be overly stressed and just do nothing but schoolwork for the entire academic week, right? You need time to relax, right? So it's important though to prioritize because oftentimes students prioritize the relaxing work first and then they start doing homework at around like what, like 10, 11 o'clock at night, oftentimes when you're really dead tired and you no longer can focus on your work, right? So it makes a lot of sense for you to get the work done first, right? And then once you know how much time you have left, like even if you say, for example, finish all your homework, let's say, have dinner and then you do a little bit of reviewing, even if you do some of that other stuff at like 9 or 10 o'clock at night, hey, that's the you time. You've deserved it. You've earned it once you've finished everything else that you needed to do that day. Okay. But don't put off the work, right? That's the really most important thing. And then the other thing too for time management is know when you're most active and alert, okay? Because if, let's say, for example, your routine is to study at very late hours, because hey, that's the last thing you prioritize that day. Something that might otherwise take you only an hour could drag on and take you 2, 3, or even 4 hours because you're spacing out, you're not as focused on the work, right? So it makes sense for you to kind of like, know yourself, know when you're most alert and productive, and then try to map out some time for you to study and focus on your schoolwork then. Okay. Oftentimes that yields some of the best results in terms of making sure that you can maintain a really good GPA. Okay, this is another really overlooked facet, right? And some students are just resigned to the fact, like, I go to a competitive high school, what sleep? I only average like 4 or 5 hours or something, right? So some students get really cynical about it, or even like it's sometimes even like a badge of pride for some students. They're like, oh, I managed to survive on just 5 hours and I still managed to get like pretty decent grades. And that might be true, but one, that's probably not sustainable. And then two, that's not ideal in the long run. Okay, so there have been studies that actually show, like, there have been studies where they tested college students, and they found there's about like a 0.14 or 0.15 GPA point higher for students who consistently get sleep versus students who are, always constantly sleepy. Right now, that's even worse if you're actually like majorly sleep deprived. Right. So there's no such thing as a teenager who can, I'm totally okay getting 5 hours a night because that catches up with you, right? So, at that point, you're probably suffering from one level or two, or from varying levels of like sleep deprivation. And that takes a toll on you eventually, right? So in fact, it's ideal. It's an optimal sleep schedule for teenagers, especially. Doctors recommend that you get about 8 or 10 hours of sleep a night as much as possible. Right. So at some point, you got to really know yourself. You got to know what you can achieve so that you have to make some sacrifices. Sometimes some students are just overextended. They're trying to do too much. Right. The reason why it's important is that this will also bear itself out in terms of your focus in class. Right. I've talked to way too many teenagers who, like, they're struggling in their classes because they can't focus. Right. They're falling asleep in the lecture. And it's not always because the teachers are boring. I mean, yeah, I'll be honest. There are going to be some teachers who are really, really boring, right? But there are certain teachers, for instance, that are really good, but if you're just exhausted, you can't keep focused no matter how interesting or engaging the teachers are. Okay, and then lastly on this topic, I do think that you should look into the possibility of taking what I call power naps, right? So there have been studies that show that if you can actually get like a burst of about 20 to 30 minutes of sleep, possibly like when you get home from school, that's going to boost your overall productivity because then you can then hit your homework after the nap and then be a lot more focused and alert. I especially find that this is helpful for students, for instance, who get really tired for one reason or another for school because maybe you do a lot of PE at school on a given day, or you have like sports practice, right? So by the time you get home, you're too tired to do practice, you're too tired to study, right? So oftentimes what I'd recommend when you take a power nap, free yourself from any distraction. I mean, turn off your computer. Don't just like turn off what do you call this, the monitor. If you can, I highly advise you to look for, like, there's certain curtains, for instance, that you can buy that practically block out any light from your window. And what you can do is you can just go ahead and put those blinds or those curtains, and then you can just knock out and get in the habit of having those 20 to 30-minute power naps as soon as you get home, right? And you will be surprised how much more alert and focused you're going to be, and that in some cases for students can make a huge difference in terms of their academic performance. Okay, so another less focused item that I think you should know about is really try to forge these good relationships with your teachers, right? Talk to your teachers, not just in class when they're calling on students, but try to email them, try to spark up conversation if you're actually back in school with them, because I think it helps you in a number of ways, right? So one, teachers are oftentimes more willing to give you the benefit of the doubt when it comes to grading, or perhaps giving you some extra assistance if you need it, right? And I think this is especially true for things like that are more subjective in nature, like writing essays, right? If you've come to your teacher and you've asked for help or advice already on an essay, they're far less likely to go ahead and just kind of like subjectively give you a bad grade, right? So you often hear these things for like essays, for instance. They're like, I don't get it. Like, I wrote a fairly similar essay to my friend, right? Not to the point where you're plagiarizing, of course, but like, like a similar quality of work, but like for one reason or another, some students tend to get better grades still, right? And unfortunately, that's something that, like, as a former English teacher myself, I know that there are going to be certain things where it is a bit subjective, right? So if you know the teacher a little bit more, I think sometimes teachers are just like, you know, they feel guilty, right? Trying to give a bad grade to a student that they know is genuinely trying hard and that they already know you pretty well. They formed a relationship with you. So, I mean, that could work. I mean, you're not just doing this because you're like, haha, I'm going to kiss up to my teacher, right? But no, I mean, genuinely take advantage of the teacher as a resource. I think that's the way to look at it. Okay. The other thing too is from a student's perspective, if you get to know your teacher and really genuinely know and admire and respect your teacher, you're far more likely to give maximum effort when it comes to the class, right? You're going to try harder. You're going to pay attention in class. You're going to go ahead and read up on whatever extra sort of articles or, extra resources that the teacher like gives your way. And so oftentimes that it does help, right? So if you actually know and like your teachers, students typically try harder for those teachers, okay? But you won't necessarily know if you like the teacher if you never talk to that person, if you never really try to participate in class. And then, of course, there's the obvious payoff, okay? If you do have these teachers that you got to know pretty well and got to know you, or they got to know you, you can get like these really strong recommendation letters from that teacher down the line when you're finally applying to college. So I think it really helps you in multiple ways to get to know your teachers pretty well. Okay, and then lastly, I have a category called homework help, right? And this doesn't always mean you get a tutor, right? Although that could be one of the options as well, right? So homework help just means that it's not always the best idea to do everything alone, right? So one, I would oftentimes suggest that you form study groups with classmates and friends who are equally academically ambitious or even more ambitious than you, okay? I like to call it success by association. Oftentimes the most successful students that I've seen often will have friends who are equally motivated, who want to go to good colleges, who also work very hard. Because if your friends are all kind of like slackers and they don't try very hard and they just, they just go out and play and, they just waste time all the time, you're likely to sort of like, that becomes like negative peer pressure, right? What you want is positive peer pressure. You want people who will help raise you up and motivate you to be more successful. Okay, now, if you're especially struggling with the academic materials, my first advice, though, is go directly to your teacher, okay? Because your teacher will be able to oftentimes give you additional like explanations, be able to help you out maybe after class or before class. But even if that doesn't work, like let's say, for example, you got some help from your teacher, but you're still really struggling, right? Then maybe you might want to seek out an outside class or a private tutor who can help you out. Because at that point, it's time to swallow your pride and just say like, hey, I can't do this on my own. Right. So yeah, it's not like, it's not like all of a sudden it's not your work. Sometimes getting help from someone who is an expert can help you see things more clearly and get you back on track. Right. So if you got a tutor or teacher who can help you sort of like maybe I uncover certain foundational weaknesses, that might help you get on track, especially for classes like math, right? Because if you struggled with certain topics the year before, it might not be that you're bad at math. It might just be that you didn't learn some foundational stuff that you should have to get you back on track with everybody else. Okay. Of course, you can also take advantage of services like HS2 Academy's Homework Club, where we will have online and in some cases in our offices, these services where teachers will be on standby to help you out with whatever help you need for whatever academic subject you're dealing with. Okay. So it's important to know when to ask for help. To be honest, even the brightest students, the ones who are like straight A's, right? Not all of them are the ones who just did it all themselves. Many times they will get assistance in one form or another. Okay. So it's important to know that, hey, you're not out there by yourself. Okay. And in many cases, you can take advantage of people who are more than happy to help you out. And sometimes it's just more efficient to get help rather than trying to rack your brain trying to figure out something that you're really struggling with. Okay, so the first bit of advice I want to give are for students who may already be straight A students. Okay, so what if you're like, hey, what do I need to listen to this lecture, right? I'm already a straight A student. Do I need any more help or advice? Well, in some cases, you might. Okay, in my experience, right, we've been working with students at HS2 who are like straight A's, but their aspirations are like the top schools. I hate to break it to you, but even if you have straight A's, it does not earn you a guaranteed admission to one of the top universities in the country. In fact, there are whole stories every single year of students who are straight A students, people who've even gotten perfect scores on the SAT or ACT, and still they get rejected by most, if not all of their schools, right? In some cases, right? So it's very important for you to know that straight A's, having great grades, that's one of the basic prerequisites you need for a top school, but it's not the end of the story, right? There are more things that you need to be doing in order for you to really strengthen your chances for a top university. Okay, so first of all, keep in mind, if you're already getting a straight A's, but you're maybe only just like a younger student, like you just finished ninth grade or 10th grade, one, do not be overconfident. School gets even harder, right? So oftentimes from what I've seen over the years is that 11th grade tends to be the hardest year for just about any high schooler. I would say most, if not all, will probably find 11th grade to be their hardest year. So, just because you got straight A's before, it does not mean that you're immune from maybe getting a B or C even in junior year. Okay. So continue to work hard, make the necessary preparations or adjustments you need in order for you to be able to handle a rigorous schedule by 11th grade. Okay. It's important to keep in mind that you're also still competing against other students at your school and across the country. So even if you have straight A's, you might want to look for other things to show that you're even more taking the initiative to go ahead and further your education. This could mean potentially doing things like taking college level courses, right? So either taking, college level courses through the ones offered by, let's say, UC Riverside and HS2, right? So every single, semester, we have classes that allow our students to go ahead and take advantage of UC GE approved courses, right? So that could be one thing that you can take advantage of. You can look at courses at your local community college. You can look at online courses from a whole range of various colleges, right? So that could be another way that you can use to strengthen your academic record relative to other students at your school. Okay, some other tips, right? If appropriate, you can seek out an internship or research opportunities with local college professors or through competitive summer programs, right? So every single year we help students plan their summers by helping them apply to like all these very, very competitive programs for whatever your major aspiration is or your career path aspiration. We know the most competitive programs and we'll be able to help advise you in terms of what programs are going to be the most suitable to help you stand out. Okay. We also advise that you seek out and compete in various activities where you can distinguish yourself from other students, right? So let's say, for example, you're interested in business, right? So activities like DECA or FBLA could be a great platform for you to show that you're actively trying to further your education in business outside of the classroom. Because let's face it, not every single high school has a business class, right? So looking outside of the classroom can be a great way to show colleges that you do have certain qualities that they're looking for, like passion for learning or love of learning, right? These are the buzzwords that a lot of colleges love to, look for evidence in your profile. So if you can show them these things, I think it goes a long way to showing that you're a more competitive student potentially. Okay. I would also advise you to look for other opportunities to showcase your love for your academic discipline, like independent research, for instance, or writing articles online about certain topics related to your major. Right? You don't have to do it necessarily with a college professor, right? Or in fact, taking like non-graded coursework through websites like Coursera, for instance, are really good value ways to show colleges that you're actually actively trying to enrich your own like learning in the field, right? Even if it's not necessarily for a college credit. Okay, now let's take a look at the opposite side of the spectrum. What if, though, you're a student who has struggled, okay, possibly because of COVID and the situation with, online learning, or maybe just, you got off on a rocky start one way or another, okay? So does that mean that there are no options available for you? Not at all, right? In fact, there's still a lot of options for you to still be able to get into a reasonably competitive college. Okay, so it's important to keep in mind, first and foremost, not to lose hope, right? So we've had many success stories of students who maybe got off on the wrong foot in ninth grade, maybe even 10th grade, but because they really start to apply themselves later on in their academic careers, they're still able to get into some pretty competitive schools overall, okay? So keep in mind that colleges actually do look at your trending grades, which means if all of a sudden maybe you got like 3 or 4 or 5 B's freshman year, but it started getting better by 10th grade, and by 11th and 12th grade, you're a straight A student. There are a lot of colleges that are more than willing to give you a fair shake, right? So they may consider you versus, let's say, for example, a student where it's the opposite direction. They might have been straight A's 9th grade and 10th grade, but starting in 11th grade, their grades start to plummet. I think the chances for those students are a little bit worse than a student who's showing more upward progress, okay? So have hope that you can sort of rebound and try to see what you can do still, right? So it's also important to keep in mind that for certain schools, for instance, like the UCs, they'll even factor in coursework that you take during the summers, right? So let's say, for example, you had a little bit of a rough 11th grade. For some students, they can still take coursework during the summer after 11th grade, and it'll still count as part of your UC GPA technically, right? So that could be another way for you to sort of like help remediate a little bit your GPA, right? And help strengthen it if you struggled a little bit more with, prior classes. Now, it's also a big surprise for some students actually that a college like Stanford, for instance, doesn't even consider ninth grade grades, right, when they recalculate your GPA. So if you got a couple of B's, let's say, for example, freshman year, but you're a straight A student, like after that, there's still very much a chance that you can apply to Stanford, right? So, don't give up hope on some colleges just because you got off on the wrong foot. Okay. And then lastly, it's important for you to seek out sound professional advice if you are struggling with your grades, right? In terms of like, what else can you do to improve? Is there a way for us to analyze if the weakness is more because you have trouble with a certain subject, or maybe you're just not studying the right way, or whether or not there could be resources that can help you boost up your grades, right? So one of the things that we're really proud of at HS2 is our counselors are very experienced and very adept at helping motivate students. They know which buttons to push to try to make them much more, motivated to learn, right? Academically, sort of like, sometimes it's like a breath of fresh air. Like students figure out like, oh, I still have a shot, right? There are certain colleges that are actually pretty good that I can still aim for. And all of a sudden, with that sort of like right mentality, they can get right back on things and be able to actually get really good grades moving forward. Okay. And we're really proud of that over the years at HS2, and that we've been able to help students become more successful academically, even if they didn't always have the best of grades to start out with. Okay, so one of the things that I do want to bring to your attention is there was a recent development in California, right? So earlier this month, right, there was a bill that was recently approved by the governor, right, that actually gives more options for students from this prior academic year, right? So this is specifically for 2020 and 2021. It doesn't really factor in the prior year, but it gives you a lot of different options in terms of how to help sort of stabilize your grade situation if you struggled. Okay, so the options are you can often request a pass-fail designation. So you've got like a C or a D in a class, for instance. You can ask that they change that to pass-fail potentially. Obviously, like it'll benefit you more if it's a pass rather than a fail, right? But if you did fail a class, though, there are options for you to make it up as well, right? So, that's definitely something, and because I can't put the entire text of the bill here, but you do want to read up on it and see, how this would affect you, right? Oftentimes, I would say your best source is actually contact your school district because they're the ones who will make the determination as to how they're going to implement this bill at your school. Okay, so the choices could be, right? You can change a grade to a pass fail. Let's say, for example, if you got like a B or C or B minus or C, and you want to just say like, oh, can I just make that pass fail because I want to try to preserve my GPA? It's an option for you, right? So keep in mind though that this is something that is going to be automatically honored by the Cal State system, but it's something that is not automatically going to be like honored by the UCs or private schools, right? So based on what I've seen so far in the language of the bill, they are mandating that the Cal States honor this, and that they're recommending the UCs honor this pass-fail designation and the making up the grades. But it's not a guarantee yet. So it's something that we're going to want to take a close look at and see how colleges react to this and whether or not they're going to be honoring this system of allowing students some form of grade relief, if you will. Okay. Now, at worst, a student can even take a makeup year if, let's say, for example, they failed too many classes and they're unable to graduate on time, right? So you can add a fifth year potentially, right, if you're really struggling. So that's definitely an option that students can avail of, right? So there are a lot of different options now. It just depends on where you lie in the spectrum and like what you're, like what happened this particular year. Okay, but I think the best source to contact is just go ahead and contact from your school or someone from your school district to help explain how AB 104 is going to impact you, right? Oftentimes, though, this is not something that will be automatic. So you're going to want to go ahead and request, let's say, for example, the pass-fail designation from your high school, and then they will then advise you on the protocol as to what to do then. Okay, but if you never say anything and you never speak up, it's not going to automatically be done for all students, mind you, right? So you definitely want to be proactive if you think this can help you out. Okay, so another thing to consider then is how is this going to impact other students? Let's say, for example, you're already a straight A student. Is this going to hurt you because there are going to be more students who have good grades? I mean, not necessarily, right? Because if they see a pass-fail designation, it's not automatically going to be viewed as an A, right? And remember, like I said, they're not just looking at GPAs in a vacuum. So let's say, for example, theoretically, because now, let's say, for example, there are students who have pass-fail designations or they just go pass, just because their GPA on paper looks slightly better, they'll still be looking at a student who got A's in those classes as being more impressive than someone who has 2 whole semesters now, because obviously, like I think the previous spring, I think most schools went with pass fail or credit no credit, right? So if they see all of a sudden 2 or 3 semesters of pass fail, it's not going to be nearly as impressive as a student who's getting straight A's. So you're fine if you did all the hard work and you basically got good grades, you will still be in a more competitive spot. Okay, this is largely for students, though, who really did suffer for one reason or another because they had difficulties with online learning or, for one reason or another, like they had I guess, mental stress issues because of the environment or the style of the learning, right? So it's more to help other students rather than necessarily hurting you, right? So I think in the long run, students who are already very competitive don't really have much to worry about. It's not necessarily going to make things harder for you. Okay, but it can potentially help students who did struggle this past year. Okay, so I think it's a win-win for everybody at that point. Okay, all right. So at this point, one of the key things that I then want to talk about is how can HS2 Academy help you, right? We talked a lot about why academics is important. And I think one of the key things that we are proud of at HS2 is we have a long track record of success, right? So every single year, we're very proud of our results, helping students get into a lot of the top universities, nationwide and even across the world, right? And this is definitely something we're proud of. And it stems in large part because of the hard work and diligence of our counseling team and our teachers, right? So we really pride ourselves on looking for people who are educators first and foremost, because we value and prioritize a student's performance. We want to make sure that students are getting the most out of their high school experience and really trying to get the best results as possible. Okay. So, with that, I want to open things up for Q&A. So if you do have any questions for me, this is the time for us to kind of like go ahead and put it in the Q&A box, please, not in the chat box. That way it'll be easier for me to go ahead and field your questions in the order that we receive them. Also, if you would like to contact HS2, we highly advise that you contact Peter, who's one of our branch managers, and he will then be able to direct you to which branch might be closest to you, or be able to help you out himself if it's in one of the areas that he covers. Okay. So with that, please go ahead and feel free to contact us. And yeah, so I'll go ahead and take a look at your questions for this evening. Okay, so let's take a look. Question number 1 says, for a CS major, what kind of curriculum rigor is recommended besides AP CS, Calculus BC? Which one would be better, AP Chem, AP Physics, or AP Biology? I would say across the board, you do want to try to have more challenging courses, not just ones that are related for your subject. I think that's the common misconception, is that parents and students are only looking for which classes are related to my major in terms of which APs to take. If you really are aiming for the top schools, you want APs in all the subjects that you can handle reasonably. Okay. Now, of course, if you had to prioritize, you definitely want things that are maybe a little bit more related to your major if you had to sort of give up 1 or 2 APs. Okay. But I would say if your aspiration is like the top schools, you definitely want APs no matter what the subject, because even schools like, let's say, Caltech and MIT, which are historically known as like the best engineering schools, they actually go out of their way to ask for recommendation letters from like your non-STEM teachers, right? Because they want to see students who are also very good writers and very good at history and other fields, right? So having APs in history and, English, for instance, are also very highly recommended. Now, typically though, if you're going for CS, I think if you were to choose a science, if that's really what all it comes down to, I would probably say that AP Physics would be the one that they would be looking at the most, in addition to the courses that you're talking about, if you really had to choose between AP Bio, AP Chem, and AP Physics. Okay. All right, next. The question here is, could you please explain a bit about UC's ELC, which is eligibility in the local context, and how does that correlate to the class ranking you mentioned? Okay, so ELC is not necessarily based on your school's ranking or grading, right? It is largely based on the data of the actual UC pool of applicants from your local area. So they define local, it could be the school or it could be your school district, right? So it automatically determines it. So if you are in the top 9% of the applicant pool from your school or from your district, you then are guaranteed a spot at a local UC, right? It doesn't have to be like, they don't really, you can't pick which UC, but it does mean that in all likelihood for ELC, that means guaranteed admission to maybe a school. Almost always it means like Merced. In some years it was like including Riverside or even Santa Cruz. But I think this year ELC is probably going to be localized to like Merced. Okay, so it's not a bad thing, but it's not a main thing that you should be shooting for. That's more like just like a fallback, right? So let's say, for example, you are in the top 9% of your class, but you say, for example, got a little overconfident and only applied to the top 2 or 3 UCs, thinking, oh, it's a guarantee I'm going to get into these schools. And for one reason or another, they were more competitive this year and you didn't bother to apply to like other UCs. ELC does give you that safety net so that you will still be guaranteed no matter what to a UC, right? But it's not really a matter of which one you're choosing. Okay, next. So Julie asks, is the number of courses taken each year, does it matter? Let's see. Is it better to take 5 courses with all A's or 6 courses with 2 B's and 4 A's? I mean, you want straight A's as much as possible, right? They don't necessarily give you bonus points just because you took 6 courses versus 5, but you also want to make sure that you're taking whatever is the expected normal course load for your school. Right. So, of course, if you're only taking 5 classes, then they know that you're not necessarily taking as rigorous a schedule. But I would say if push came to shove, I would still say straight A's is still definitely more of a priority than if you took 6 classes, but you got 2 B's as a result. Right. I would take the 5 courses with A's if you had to choose between those 2. But ideally, I think in most schools, though, you probably want 6 classes. I think that's more or less the standard for most high schools in California. So 6 classes, it's just a matter of like how many APs you should be taking, I think, right? And that's all about calibrating, how many APs or honors classes you think you can handle. Okay, so Jesse asked for AB 104, can we request pass fail for one of 4 years, which would get a bad grade, and others keep real score as a choice or need all 4 years of change? I believe it only, so far based on the text of the bill, Jesse, it only pertains to 2020 to 21. So just this past academic year, right? It will have no bearing at all on, other years and 4 years of high school, just this past year. Okay. So, to be honest, I'm not even sure the text is very vague in terms of, which ones, is it going to be the entire semester pass fail, or can you pick certain classes? So this is why I really want all of you to inquire directly with your school district to see how they're planning to implement the bill. The bill is pretty vague about it, to be frank, right? So you would want to basically check in, try to see, and in most cases, I think it's probably going to be a class by class determination if it's pass fail, right? But that also kind of also sometimes looks suspicious, right? Because if you have like 3 A's and 3 passes, then they're going to wonder what those other 3 passes would be, right? So in some cases, you might want to like ask the school, whether or not it would be best to just go pass for the entire semester, right? Rather than them leaving them to wonder, why you had some with A's or B's and why the rest were pass, right? So it could be a matter of strategy. We don't know for sure, right? This is all brand new stuff, and it's yet to be seen how schools and school districts will specifically implement this. Okay. All right. Next. Hi. Will a summer program's grade matter to your GPA? I asked the teacher about it, and she said she gives a certificate of completion. Well, this is definitely something that you want to check with a summer program right off the bat, right? So schools where it's largely coursework and it is meant to give you transferable credits, oftentimes it'll be pretty clear cut. If they say certificate of completion, probably not, right? And it will not necessarily go directly into your school's transcript, but oftentimes if you take coursework that's college level and you take it outside of your school, oftentimes what you're going to want to do is then request a transcript from that institution and then send it directly to the schools that you'd be applying to. And they will do their own in-house determination of how that factors into your GPA. Okay. All right. Next, which major is easier to get an A in college, biology or biochemistry? It depends on the school. It depends on the individual instructor. There are a lot of different factors, so it's really hard to tell. Some students fare better in chemistry for one reason or another. Some fare better in bio. So it's not an easy thing to answer. It's a very individualized case, not only for the individualized student, but also the individualized college. So I can't really answer like which one is inherently harder, I guess, bio or biochemistry. I think, it's really important too for, when you go into college, to feel out which one you would want to take in the first place. Let's say, for example, if you really do prefer, the upper level chemistry electives, then maybe taking biochem might be better for you, right? So it's not necessarily which one is inherently harder. It's definitely something where each college student has to make a determination as to whether or not it's going to be best suited for them. Next question, do I have to take the SAT? I'm a 10th grade student. We advise that you do, right? Because for the most part, many of the schools that have said that they're going to be test optional, the most competitive schools have only committed to this coming rising senior group, right? So if you're currently a rising 10th grader, by the time you're a senior, it's very foreseeable that a lot of the top schools are going to go back to requiring the SAT or ACT. If your priorities are just the UCs, it's not going to affect you, right? Because as a current 10th grade student, you're still going to be in that cycle where the UCs are going to be test blind, but very few students only limit themselves to just the UCs, right? So a lot of students are also going to be shooting for private schools in their mix of colleges. So it's very advisable for you to also have, an SAT or ACT score so that you can apply to a wider range of schools. It's more recommended that you do, because worst case scenario, like if you don't do as well in the SAT, shift gears and try the ACT. If you're not doing well, then yes, maybe you can examine, or you can explore options for going test optional for certain schools if like you're really not able to get a good test score. But at this point, it's such an early part of the process that you do want to explore how you might potentially do on the SAT or ACT first. Okay. All right. Next, would AP Calculus be C or AP Statistics be better? okay, for senior year, if you're thinking of a CS major? Well, it's largely widely considered that Calc BC is viewed as the more rigorous course, whereas AP Statistics is typically viewed as a softer or easier math course, okay? So if your aspiration is more competitive CS schools, then yes, I would highly advise you to look into Calculus BC first, okay? Will a cheating contract really matter to your college applications? How can I prove it to tell a college I know my mistake? Okay, so I mean, if there are disciplinary situations like that, there are places in the college application that can potentially help you with that situation, right? You might also definitely want to, talk to your school counselor about how to approach that. At HS2, we've had a couple of students in the past that have had situations like this, and what we try to do is help them draft the explanation to make it in the most favorable light, so that it shows that you've actually like learn from your lessons, right? That you are, that you try your best to go ahead and, did better and not like repeat the same mistakes, okay? That you're truly genuinely and sincerely apologetic for it. Okay, so for schools that don't publish rankings, how do they know whether you are in the 9%? So I'm assuming this is for ELC. Don't forget, this is not based on any published ranking from your school. This is based on their determination, right? So they will have a database based on everybody who's applying from your school based on all the applications. So it's UC calculated, it's on their end, not your school's end. So it's their determination whether or not you're ELC eligible, and they'll let you know, right? So it's really kind of, to be honest, out of your control. So it's best not to even worry about it and just make sure that you're applying to a broad enough range of UCs that you don't need to take advantage of or rely on ELC. Okay. Next, do top colleges want to see students take a second language class for at least 3 years? My daughter passed AP Chinese test, but didn't take any Chinese classes. Does that meet second language requirement? Oftentimes it does, yes, right? So they're not looking, when they say like recommended 3 years, they mean up to the third year level of a language. So if you already passed AP Chinese, you don't technically need to take a foreign language, but it's also good to show that you're using that class slot to full advantage, because if you're just taking an easy route and only taking 5 classes and just taking free periods, that's not going to look very impressive at all. So oftentimes we advise students maybe explore a third language, okay? Or maybe continue to take like double up on math or science classes if you're going for a STEM major, right? So you don't have to take another language. You don't have to take a language for 3 years in high school if you already passed the highest level available, right? So that's an important consideration, okay? Any advice for Duke University application? Its ranking is not super top, number 20 or so. That's not true. Duke is widely considered like a top 10, top 12 school. In fact, if you looked at the latest US news rankings, let me see, actually, we might be able to pop it in together here. Okay, oops, how do I get out of here? Okay, so it's definitely, yeah, so it's number 12, right? And in fact, based on recent years, it's got acceptance rates very, very similar to like the Ivies. I think Duke is probably like around 8 or 9% acceptance rate. So it's actually very, very competitive, right? So in fact, it's typically viewed as on par with, many Ivies as far as the selectivity and based on the academic reputation. So you'd want to approach it much the same way as you would like, some top flight schools. I mean, maybe not quite at the same tier as like a Harvard or Princeton or Yale, but I mean, it would be similar in competition to like maybe like a Dartmouth or Cornell at least, right? Probably fairly similar to like even a Brown or UPenn potentially, right? So yes, you do want to make sure that you're keeping up to date with as far as the rankings and as far as the acceptance rates for these schools. So yes, so Duke is a very, very competitive school, especially for fields like biology, biomedical engineering. They're very, very outstanding at that. And a lot of the social sciences, they're very good as well. Okay, next, if I take a CSU transferable course, which is related to the major I want to do at a local community college, would it look good for UCs on my application anyway? I understand this course will not be calculated in their UC's weighted GPA. If it's only CSU transferable, sure, it's better than not taking a course. But that's oftentimes why I'd recommend, if you're going to take a course, do your research before, right? Ideally, if you're going to invest the time and energy to take a course, you may as well look for courses that are UC and CSU transferable, right? So like, for instance, like if you took a course with like UCR, like the ones that are offered through HSU Academy, those are guaranteed to transfer at any UC because they're already approved as GE courses for any UC, Okay, so yes, it's still definitely worth reporting, even if they won't necessarily give you credits for it. But in the future, if you were to take a look at the course, I highly recommend that you look for one that you know for sure is going to transfer for the UCs. Okay, all right, so I think I have time to just finish up maybe like 2 or 3 more questions here. All right, so next question here is for an elite computer science school, if I take AP Bio, AP Chem, AP History before senior year, but AP Calculus is the only one I can take in 12th grade. Do I need to take AP Calc BC exams outside of school in 11th grade or take it in 12th grade? Okay. I mean, just take it the year you're taking it. There's no point in taking something. So, I mean, it would seem unnecessary or backwards for you to take the AP test before you take the class, right? Colleges would just really wonder. And in fact, that'll just reinforce this mentality. There's the stereotype of Asian students as being like really too test obsessed, right? So don't worry about it. Like if you're taking AP Calc BC senior year, that's when you take the AP test. Don't try to take it before because that just causes all this needless self-studying. If you really want to impress colleges, 11th grade, take an extra college class or two. Okay, it doesn't have to be math, right? You can take a coding class if you're interested in computer science, right? Take like intro to or intermediate Java or Python. I think that'll probably be a better payoff than investing all this time and energy self-studying for an AP that you're going to take in 12th grade anyway. Okay. Next, for an engineering major, what course do you recommend to take besides AP Physics, AP Bio, or AP Chemistry? That's a matter of personal preference, right? So it's just a matter of which one the student feels that they can do better in, right? So not everything has to be related to engineering, right? So go with whichever one. Well, first and foremost, I mean, they're both APs. So maybe whichever one a student feels like they can get a better grade in, like if they're more confident they can get an A in bio, for instance, go for that, okay? And okay, maybe the last one here, it says, if I take, okay, no, I think that's a duplicate, all right? So in the last one here, if you take an AP class during 8th to 9th grade summer, will it count as taken on 9th grade? Okay, so that's weird. You would be taking an AP class in the summer? It's like an actual school AP class in the summer? Yeah, I suppose you're going to want to check specifically with your school on that one, right? Just because like they will let you know when you take it. I assume it should be counted as 9th grade because it's a high school level class and you can't take the AP test during the summer. So it's most likely going to have to be counted as 9th grade if you're taking the corresponding AP exam for that course. But, you know, I would highly dissuade students from taking AP classes in the summer anyway. It's just not ideal, right? Because for one, you're taking the whole class and then you have like several months in the interim between then and when you take the AP class. It's not a very good situation in most cases, right? So if you're going to do that, you might as well take a college level class because you get the credits immediately based by virtue of the fact that you're taking the college class, right? So if you're taking an AP class in the summer, check in with the school that you're taking that with, and they'll be able to tell you. But I would assume that most likely 9th grade would be the answer to that question. Okay. All right. So thank you so much. That's all the time I have for today for Q&A. I hope you found our seminar helpful. And yes, so join me again for Q&A next week. And then I will be doing another one of these English seminars at some point next month as well. So join me for that as well. All right. So have a great weekend, everybody. And yes, I hope to see you again in a future seminar. Okay. Good night. Bye.